And we welcome into the studio U.S. Representative Steve Russell. Always good to catch up with you, sir. Good to see you.
Thank you, Dave. It's great to be with you.
Welcome back to Oklahoma. Here's the storms. It's the spring in Oklahoma.
I know. I mean, I tell people in Washington every spring, Oklahomans just learn to duck. You know?
Also, you learn about towns called Cookie Town and things,
right.
Places you've never really heard of in the state.
That's it.
Nothing against the fine residents of Cookie Town. But some of these towns you hear about during weather season or perhaps high school football season.
You do, and I think it unites and connects Oklahomans too. True. Every weather season, because we're all glued, to the news stations, and our meteorologists in the state are just unsung heroes.
Do a great job.
They save lives. Yep. Because we're all like, okay, should we stay? Should we go left? Should we go right?
Right.
And they just do great work.
Well, we're catching up with U.S. Representative Steve Russell about his recent trips. We'll get into your trip down to Houston here in a second, sure. And perhaps some upcoming journeys to the West Coast. He's an interesting guy to talk about pilot license if you ever have a chance. But perhaps more serious topics to begin with. North Korea. President Trump prepping to meet with North Korea leader Kim Jong-un. So let me lead off with this. How should the president approach this in your opinion, and what would you like to see coming out of that meeting?
I think the president has created space that we've not had since 1953. It's been remarkable that we're to this point, that we have senior officials like the Secretary of State meeting with Kim Jong-un prior. That didn't shut the negotiations down. In fact, it seems like they've kind of moved further along. The president has been adamant that bad behavior is not going to be rewarded. And you look at the relationships that the United States has built with President Xi of China, with Prime Minister Abe of Japan, with President Park in South Korea. Okay, these are three nations that a lot of times can go to blows on foreign policy and different issues, and historically have gone to blows militarily with one another, and yet they all have one of the best relationships with the United States now, where the leaders have direct contact with our president. And that's really unusual. And I think because of that, we see that President Xi has been working very successfully in navigating all of the thorny issues with Kim Jong-un. And I also have to think that, the trip to China that Kim Jong-un made, not long back, might have been a go into the woodshed moment, because it had to have been conveyed. You can't necessarily count on, we're going to underwrite all of your bad behavior. And so Kim Jong-un
think the Chinese leadership leaned on him and said,
no question,
hey.
No question. And not only that, but they've actually worked well with us, in that even in talking about what we do, we've cooperated on sanctions, we've cooperated on military involvement, even together, which is just amazing in talking about North Korea. And so it's interesting to see what has developed. So what will be on the table? I think it will be this. What will Kim Jong-un's angle be that he expects to get out of this? He knows he cannot keep nuclear weapons. Everyone except for him has stated that is not an option. So he's looking to maybe have a formal end of the Korean War. 1953, yeah, it's probably time. So here we are. The other thing is normalize relations with other countries around the world, where they have their embassies and they have their ambassadors and they do all of that. They have a problem collecting friends in the world, and this might open up some avenues. Will they continue to be an irritation to the world? No doubt. Will they use their statecraft to posture in ways that will be unpleasant? I have no doubt, simply because of the habits that they've had historically. But those are things that we can look at that do not have a material detriment to the nations involved in this crisis. Now, what will they have to give up? Nuclear weapons. But there are certain things that we can ensure, even if they hide a device or two. The capacity to launch intercontinental ballistic missiles can clearly be curtailed. They have vulnerabilities with rocket engines. You know, you can read all of that in open sources. Last time I checked, rockets don't fly too well without an engine. So, you know, this is something that, that they don't produce. So there's a means to curtail that. The other thing is re-entry vehicles, where they actually go out of orbit, and not just low orbit, but they go up and out, and then they come back and re-enter the atmosphere. They're not there yet. And there are certain key mechanisms and components that we can control and ensure that they don't have. Also with plutonium enrichment in the same way, there are certain things that they can remove that will prevent that, and that is inspectable, and it's something that is detectable. I had a great privilege to meet with some nuclear physicists that had actually been into Pyongyang in 2009 and 2012, and they are convinced that there are Achilles heels-like things that you can do. And so I think all of those things will be on the table on our side. And if we get to that, what won't be on the table, there's not going to be some pallet of cash with billions of dollars on it, you know, to fund nefarious actors. There's not going to be a removal of our troops from the peninsula. That would be just a non-starter. But it could truly be the beginning of a better relationship. And I think all sides will benefit. Kim Jong-un could go down as the guy that maybe turned it around.
Do you think it's too optimistic to think that?
I think
given
he was one step from annihilation, and I think most dictators have one thing in common: they want to survive. And the key to their survival is they're all masters of miscalculation at some point. He can have an epiphany and become a benevolent dictator, or he can double down on stupidity, and while all of the nations involved would certainly be disrupted and there would be casualties and it would be horrible and our economies would suffer, we would all survive. He would not, and neither would North Korea. And so the only true, complete loser in this would be him. So he surely has to reflect on that. But you know, we want to see deeds, not words.
Yeah, the president called him open and honorable. Would you agree with that assessment, or is it?
So far, here's what we know. There has not been a rocket launch since September. We have seen leaders in the region engaged and with open lines of communication with one another.
We saw the two Korean leaders meet.
Right. Now, you know, I don't get too excited when the two Koreas, you know, want to have this. They are really optimistic in trying to find a solution sometimes in the South, completely understandable. We saw that with the two Germanys for a long time. But there has to be a complete change of behavior in the North, and if there is, good behavior can have good reward. Look at the nation of Vietnam, for example. You know, they are quickly becoming one of our best allies in the region. Who would have thunk it? I mean, 50 years ago, no one would have imagined being able to vacation in Hanoi and play golf, right? Today you can. And American businessmen are going there, and women, and opening and doing trade. And so a behavioral change can work, but it takes time.
Be interesting to see how that unfolds and develops.
It doesn't hurt to give it a try, but again, it can't be like the Iran deal or something like that, where we're naive and we, you know, hand over the keys to the kingdom and then say, okay, you know, yes, you've been a terrible person and terrible behavior, but you know, we're still going to let you trash our house. No, I don't think so, and we're not doing that in this arrangement.
Shifting gears, Scott Pruitt testified before Congress last week. He faces some ethics controversies. Do you think he should resign?
Well, we want to see all sides of the issue, and there are two sides. I was chairing the Oversight and Government Reform Committee hearing on, we had the Comptroller General, Gary Dodaro, and brilliant man, and he's finding all of this waste. And well, next door in judiciary, I mean, you've got the media circus, and you've got, you know, hundreds of people, you know, whatever. But I think Mr. Pruitt, obviously, Oklahomans know him. We know that
former State Attorney General here.
He has a good reputation by us. I think Our reaction, many of us here, is, okay, let's hear the facts, let's hear the other side, and not some, playing stump the chump, while you're sitting in the hot seat, in a hearing. But he is going to have to answer to an awful lot of questions. And if the data or the scenarios have a different light, I think people will accept that. If they don't, I think that he's going to have to answer to it. And case in point, Ryan Zinke, Secretary of Interior, somebody that I know well and have been to his home in Montana, and he's a Navy SEAL, and we served in Congress together. He was attacked, for his travel and this, that, and the other, and he stood firm, and he said, I don't care what they think. I didn't do that, and here's what I did do, and the investigations will show that. And guess what? He was right. He was exonerated. So you really don't know until here we have Mr. Pruitt, who has done honorable things in his past. So I think many of us in Oklahoma say, well, okay, let's give him time to give his side of the story.
All right, we're chatting with U.S. Congressman Steve Russell, U.S. Representative here for 5th Congressional District in Oklahoma. Looking ahead to next week, the defense authorization that pops up could have some impact, I believe, on Tinker and Altus, something we care about a whole lot here in Oklahoma. What are you seeing there?
Well, one of the things that could have an immediate impact, and I have talked to the Secretary of the Air Force on this issue, Heather Wilson, who's magnificent Air Force Secretary, by the way. Talked with Boeing representatives last week. Talked to the Tinker commander and the Logistics Command commander, I should say, that's based here at Tinker on this issue. The KC46 fueler can be completely on schedule as of spring of 19. There's been some software issues, this, that, and the other, but if in the defense authorization this year we delay that, that would be a huge mistake. A couple of reasons. They're talking about a delay of 6 aircraft. If they do that, 3 are needed for the training base at Altus Air Force Base. And it doesn't matter how many airframes you have produced if you don't have people trained to operate them. So that's going to be important. And then the other 3 are needed clearly, for the field so that they get going. And this was scheduled. It's not like this wasn't the plan. It was the plan. They're talking about altering the plan to try to make savings somewhere else. Here's another aspect of it. Boeing took this contract at fixed cost. Now, typically, these big primes come in and say, yeah, we'll do it for this cost plus. Well, cost plus is a disaster because they know that they're not on the hook if there's delays or, if something happens, and they just keep, feeding off Uncle Sugar there, and here it comes. Well, Boeing didn't do that. They took fixed cost and said, we'll do that. So any delays they eat. And people say, well, serves them right. Well, not necessarily. What message are we sending as a Congress when we have big defense companies that say, okay, we will quit playing the game of cost plus, and then we impose a delay on them? That is a bad message to send, and I think we need to honor the agreements and we need to let them get the aircraft delivered.
I believe the last time we spoke was back in January, and at that point we touched on Niger. You had been there. Recently, some of the families have received briefings. There'll be a public briefing coming out, and this deals with 4 soldiers who were killed in Niger last October. You've read the public briefing already.
Well, I have read the classified briefing,
and
the
public briefing
there have been some statements that have been put out by Secretary Mattis, and I've also been on the ground. In fact, as I'm reading the reports and what had happened, I had been on the helicopters that they had talked about. I had been to the areas where the special forces were operating out of. I've been to those locations. It was really important for me to get in there and have those discussions and see it firsthand. And so because of that, I have a unique perspective going into this. Members of Congress will be afforded a classified briefing when we return next week. And then from there, the families also are being notified, and then there will be a public briefing that will be given, and then we'll see what that is. As I've read the classified reports, there's been some interesting background information as far as the chain of decisions and then the layers of support that, was available or not, and the complicating factors there. But nothing has really changed my conclusion, Dave, that the single most responsible cause for the death of our Special Forces soldiers there was an aggressive and opportunistic enemy that was unknown, and they took a risk and launched an ambush. It was the first time ever we've had a fatality in Niger. We've been working there for decades. So I think we have to keep that in context. And there was nothing in the classified report that changes my mind that, it was some lack of this or lack of that that resulted in the soldier's death. It was an aggressive, opportunistic, Al-Qaeda and ISIS-based, really an ISIS-affiliated based enemy that resulted in the death of those soldiers.
So the public briefing is coming up, and again, we'll hear more on the defense authorization next week. You mentioned that you're back at work in Washington coming up as well. However, you've been here last week and this week. Tell us about your trip to Houston.
Well, I went down to Houston to visit Cisco, Cisco with an S, S-Y. And Cisco does an awful lot of our food production and grocers and the like. FreshPoint is a Cisco company here in Oklahoma City. And what's exciting about what companies like FreshPoint do is that they take small producers and growers. So, when I'm out in Pottawatomie County or Seminole County and you have people that, they're raising crops or they're, raising food, they go out and they may be too small to attract the attention of some major distribution chain, and then trying to go to a farmer's market and that sort of thing is tough because, so if we're going to maintain the way of life of our farmers, ideas and approaches like what we see with FreshPoint doing is magnificent, because they will pool together the small producers and then, okay, you're all growing spinach or whatever it is, and we'll bring all of that together, and then we'll have a bunch of spinach, and then we'll put it in the grocery stores locally for you. And Oklahomans are allowed to eat locally grown food, which many prefer because it's right here, it's fresh, and it's just a win-win for everybody. So I was invited to go down to Houston to look at the bigger operation where their national headquarters is with Cisco, and was just blown away by all the things that they do. From supplying, all of the apparatus for kitchens and, warehouses, not to mention helping people eat. And then I went down and met with Frontera on some energy issues. As you know, we've talked about what Russia's doing in Eastern Europe and a lot of the former Soviet republics and how they're being nefarious. Well, what we're seeing in the Republic of Georgia right now is the Russians are literally stealing the country under our very noses, and companies in the United States and Great Britain and our Western allies in France, they have done investment and they send workers and they help, and they're helping people be employed there. And much like Hugo Chavez did in Venezuela, we're starting to see Bidzina Ivanishvili, this oligarch who's now re-entered the political process, and he essentially owns the country, and he's starting to destroy U.S. and Western companies and their holdings that are there. So I wanted to go visit one specifically to get their insights in a much lengthier time where we're not messing with votes and all of that. And I did have discussions with them earlier. But it's very important that not only do we protect the investment that we see in partner nations, but that we also really, you're just going to have people come in and be big bullies, and then they're going to nationalize something and take away something. So I'm watching that very closely. So I tried to string several things together while I was down in Houston for that trip to deal with these issues.
All right, and then moving forward, I mentioned off the top some trips to the West Coast. I believe you're speaking at Stanford, maybe, or
I am.
Catching up with...
I'll be going back to Stanford. I was there in February at a national security conference on North Korea that was hosted by the Aspen Institute. Was honored to attend that. But this will be a little different. Ambassador Eikenberry, former ambassador to Afghanistan, and a retired 3-star general. He is now teaching and heads up a lot of foreign policy things at Stanford University. And they have asked me to come out and speak to War College fellows and also students on foreign policy and national security. And the theme will be old enemies in a new era. And so it bodes well. They're going to be bringing in experts in the fields of those that have dealt with North Korea, Russia, the competitiveness that we see with China and some of these other things. And it looks to be a really good session. It'll be about a day and a half, a deep dive, and you never know what students are going to hone in on. So I'm really looking forward to it.
I remember speaking at a conference in Stanford, had absolutely nothing to do with the gravity that he's talking about. It was a media conference a couple years ago, and I'm walking the campus, which is
beautiful.
Yeah, and I'm like, yeah, there's genius over here, genius over there.
I felt that way when I was there. It was like we had former Secretary of State George Shultz, 97, still sharp as a tack. And former Defense Secretary William Perry was there, and you had all of these smart people, and then me. I was invited, but it was an honor to be there to give my perspective.
U.S. Representative Steve Russell, sir, we always appreciate your time.
Thank you, Dave. It's great to give you an update. I appreciate very much.
Very good. Again, thank you very much, and safe travels.
Thank you.